Taking their experience making keyboards and applying it to leverless controllers, the Varmilo FK2 aims to bring solid build quality and competitive tech to the scene. The killer feature here is their rapid trigger inductive switches that aim to deliver the fastest possible inputs. Essentially, the FK2 switches deactivate the moment that they're released, letting you engage again without letting the button return to neutral. Combined with certain SOCD settings, it's tech that's been recently deemed as straight up cheating by certain parts of competitive PC gaming. Thankfully, the FGC has already had this fight years ago and has more or less set some competitive standards for what inputs are allowed. I was personally skeptical of the rapid trigger tech, as I'm someone who generally prefers a heavier button to avoid misinputs. But combined with the very low default actuation force, the FK2 made a surprising difference in my execution. Especially in Tekken, anime games focus on chains and cancels, and older games where the input buffers were much stricter, I immediately found my inputs much more consistent. By the same token, it's possible to make your execution even worse. If you're someone like me who mashes under high pressure situations, you're likely to get multiple wrong inputs with how light the actuation force is. At the default of 0.3 millimeters, the buttons will actuate by simply brushing against them, almost as if you were using a capacitive touchscreen. Thankfully, the other benefit of these inductive switches is that you can set the actuation force, allowing you to set your individual preference for how heavy each individual button is. I personally prefer my switches to stay the same for consistency, but if you wanted to have your movement buttons, attacks, and special function macros to actuate differently, you could. Speaking of macros, the FK2 sports 2 extra buttons over the standard hitbox layout, comfortably sitting on the thumb positions flanking the jump button. If you followed me for any period of time, you know that I'm a huge proponent of thumb buttons, so I was ecstatic to see this, especially without any of the haphazard placements that many other leverless controllers use. And if you follow me for any amount of time, you also know what I'm going to say next. Where's the second up button? A WASD style up button would suit so many more games, including 3D fighters, rhythm games, and platform fighters. And while we're speaking theoreticals, I'd have loved if the buttons were a bit larger, and possibly spaced out a little bit more. For such a robust controller, very little of its massive surface area is used, and the smaller sized buttons make it difficult to perform techniques like a 2-finger tap for rapid presses, ironically making it a little bit hard to take advantage of its rapid trigger feature. Another limiter is the web configurator. The FK2 settings can be accessed by a website, not unlike the VIA configurator for keyboards. This is a standout improvement over installing yet another piece of software on your computer, but it is overall limited. You can swap inputs, change the trigger distance of your switches, test your buttons, and change your SOCD, but compared to other controllers, especially those with the GP2040CE firmware, it feels limited. There's no additional controller profiles, modifiers, or any other features like that, and it has very little flexibility. None of these are deal breakers, but when even budget controllers these days pack so many features as standard, it's hard not to compare. Another sticking point for some people might be the inclusion of small supports in the buttonholes to keep the caps from wobbling. I personally didn't find issue with them, but I've already heard others complain about them adding a scratchiness to the buttons, and had a few people question if they were a manufacturing error, to the point where Varmilo had to add clarification on their product page. Again, I personally had no issue with them, but some might be more sensitive to the details than me. There's also the strange inclusion of an unused auxiliary button, which might speak to Varmilo's future plans for compatibility. As of now, it's only compatible with PC, and has less firmware features and fewer buttons than what is now the standard. That leaves the FK2 to compete only on its button feel and build quality. Thankfully, it really does feel that good. The smooth surface, tapered edges, and color choices are excellent, and paired with the size and weight, the FK2 stands out. Varmilo's experience with keyboards definitely helped out here, and it's easy to think of this as a dedicated gaming keyboard, albeit one with a lot fewer keys. So who is this controller for? I'd say this is for you if you're a high-end keyboard enthusiast transitioning from other competitive games to fighting games, or you're looking for an entry-level controller and you're willing to trade customization and console compatibility for performance and build quality. As for me, the FK2 won't be my go-to for casual gaming sessions, but it will likely come out during those more serious competitive grinds. There's just something about taking it out of its case and setting down a piece of heavy equipment that makes me feel like I'm gearing up for something serious.